first question you're going to ask is, okay, well, can I understand your data business a little bit better? Are you a data broker? Do you have an identity graph? Are you a controller of data? Are you a processor of data? Okay. And then to your point, okay, let's say we land on the fact that they're an identity graph, right? And they have the ability to stitch together these digital identifiers, these digital linkages, to unify and create this persistent identifier of who these individuals are. But there's different ingredients inside of an identity graph. And there's really two big ingredients that make an identity graph.
You're listening to the Digital Data Cafe podcast, where we talk about everything data-driven in your world. Join us each week to hear from the world's top business and industry leaders on why using data in a digital world matters. Here's your host, Albert Thompson.
All right. Welcome, podcast folks. I'm Albert Thompson, your host from Digital Data Cafe. And I'm with my co-host, Jason Harris. If you guys take a look here, we took it outside. It's hard to do work when it's 88 degrees. I get to be that guy for all of you out there that's like, oh man, look at the backyard. But Jason, how you doing?
I am doing well, man. Thank you. This is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have a good time today. I love anytime we get a chance to sit down, and especially on a sunny day like today, but anytime we get a chance to sit down and talk data, I just get overly excited about that. And I think today's topic is so incredibly timely, especially with every agency out there trying to maximize every single dollar that's being spent for their clients. More and more data companies are popping up. Like it seems like weekly. There's like a new provider out there,
Yeah, I think there is. I think a lot of companies out there are seeing, the opportunity to, dive into the world of data. And I think, it's definitely an attractive vertical. It makes a lot of sense. It's where the economy is looking for, marketing officers and executives are looking for the opportunity to find better ways to engage their customers, right?
Yes.
They're looking for ways to personalize their marketing and really truly understand this looming, death of the third-party cookie. I think a lot of platform companies are trying to pop up and trying to all solve that problem. So you have to, really understand, what it means and who you're dealing with.
Well, and it's who are you dealing with? I've been hit up, because my title on LinkedIn is, director of marketing. I've been hit up by more data companies, I think probably in the last, 30 to 45 days, that I didn't even know existed, to be totally honest with you. I was like, hey, you're in charge of marketing, so you need to be buying data from us. And, we have the best. What's funny is out of all the emails I've gotten from all these people that are wanting to sell me data, every one of them is the best, Albert. Every single one. They're all number one. Did you know that?
Yeah. I think that's like with anything, right? Everybody's the best. I remember, man, and this back in the day with automotive, everything was proprietary. Everything was AI and machine learning. It's like, come on, you have an agency or whatever the case is, but it's highly unlikely that you're the number one at everything. But, I think there's a lot of good players in the space that are solving some big problems. And I think there's, other, companies that you have to sometimes look a little deeper and ask the right questions.
Well, and I'm so glad you said that, because that's a perfect segue into our topic today. It's like, not all data companies are created equal. And, if you're a marketer out there, if you're an agency owner, this is your podcast. This is the podcast. All right. If you're not, you need to go get that person, bring them in. All right. This is the podcast for you, because today we're talking about, how do we vet these companies? What questions do we need to ask to ensure that we're getting the best data set for our clients to improve our marketing efforts? So I know the first question that everyone should be asking. Go ahead, Albert, take it away. What's the first question they should be asking?
Yeah, I think the first, a lot of firsts, right? I can think of about 10 firsts. But for me, I think the first one, right, is really understanding, the foundational way that they're sourcing or collecting their data or even building their data, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are they doing that? That's the first question I would be asking.
Yeah, right. It's like, like everybody out there is claiming they have the best identity graph in the world. Everybody else's identity graph is crap. We're the only one you should be working with. We have the best, right? So, how I think to your point, I think it's one of the first questions you should be asking is how is your identity graph built? And there's a lot of different ways to do that. So I'll ask you, Albert, like, if I'll play agency, you play data company. All right. I'm asking you, what should I kind of expect when I ask that question of how is your identity graph built?
Well, I think the first question is, first off, understand this, right? There's a lot of companies that proclaim they have data and I think are really, almost masquerading as, companies that are really controllers of data, right? So there's really two types of data um, companies that move data, right?
Yes.
There's what's controllers, meaning like they actually are the companies that own and control the data. They have an identity graph. They're stitching these data linkages together, creating persistent identifiers. That's super important. Then there's processors, right? Processors are folks that could take that data, or they buy data from data brokers, and they try to stitch it together in some unified way so that you can use it for some marketing or some offline or online digital activation. And they're not really the owners or the controllers or the consent managers, so to speak, of that data and their processors. So I
So would
think,
you consider them like a reseller, like the more of like a reseller? They're taking data, doing this very minimal processing on it, and then just kind of reselling it back out.
yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair to say. I mean, it's, listen, it could be a little bit more in depth than that because they might add some of their own special sauce. But, the main thing is, right, you need to know the difference. Are you a controller of data or a processor of data? And they all serve their own purposes.
No, what would be the benefit? All right. So if I'm talking to a data company, like I said, I'm playing agency today. So I'm talking to a data company. How does it benefit me, the agency, of working with someone who controls versus someone who processes?
All right, I think that's a great question, right? So, first off, it's all about the context of data protection and privacy, right? Um,
Yes.
Super important. So let's talk about in the context of data protection and privacy laws. A data controller is the entity. Let me get this right. The entity that will be the person that or the company that will determine the purposes of how the personal data is processed, how it's stitched together, how is the identities resolved, how is that personal data collected on behalf of these consumers? How is it managed? How is the opt-in managed? Additionally, the controller is the one that has the overall responsibility for ensuring that personal data is processed in compliance, right, with other relevant data protection laws. So this means making sure that how it's collected, how it's stored, ensuring that the data is accurate, it's up to date, making sure that individuals are provided with appropriate notices, right? I mean, that opt out and the management and the consent is super important. Also, the controller is going to be the one responsible for responding back and forth with the data subjects, right? So, like, hey, if a data request comes in, an audit request comes in, that's the entity that's the main company that's controlling that. Where the processor, on the other hand, right, is more responsible for processing the data on behalf of the controller,
So
right? So
they're kind of like this middleman. They're not necessarily responsible for they should be responsible, but it's kind of this weird area because they're not the ones that are kind of putting their neck on the line saying that this is consent. We have that record on staff because they're playing middleman. Would that be a good way to look at it?
yeah. I mean, ultimately, the processor is going to be the one that's going to be responsible for processing, the data on behalf of the controller's instructions, right?
Gotcha.
So, like, if we're working with somebody that's utilizing our data, we're a controller, right? So, Driven IQ is a controller of data,
Hmm.
and so this is a long way of talking about the identity graph, right? Whereas the processor, they might take our identity graph and they might utilize the data, right, to implement whatever technical or marketing measurement or whatever application that they have. And there's going to be measurements in place that we're going to require them to protect the personal data, and they must comply with those requirements to continue to be able to do data processing or identity resolution, for example. So it's worth noting that you should know the difference of if you're engaging with a processor or controller. So I think that's the first one, right? And I think going back to that identity graph, right? Super important. right? Because the identity graph is the foundational way that you are as a controller, right? So you probably won't have an identity graph, so to speak, if you're a processor, right?
And
You
if
may.
you do, it's somebody else's. Because, like you said, you're kind of this middleman. Like you may have gotten some data from another company that did utilize an identity graph and combined it with another set, so on. But the controllers, if their controller data, they have their own identity graph. This is the one thing I love about this because, growing up, my mom worked in restaurants, right?
Mhm.
And I'm always fascinated with chefs. I love watching cooking shows at home with my kids and everything like that because at the end of the day, it's the same ingredients, but it's the chef that can make
Mhm.
the biggest difference, right? And I don't know, maybe that's the way my brain is processing it, but that's how I kind of see these controllers, right? Is that a lot of them are kind of working with similar ingredients. Maybe some of them have some slightly different ingredients, but it's their ability to put that together that makes a wildly different dish at the end of the day.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's a really actually a very, very good segue to talk about the ingredients that make up identity graphs,
Yes,
right?
let's do that.
Because really, if you think about it, so let's say the first question you're going to ask is, okay, well, can I understand your data business a little bit better? Are you a data broker? Do you have an identity graph? Are you a controller of data? Are you a processor of data? Okay. And then to your point, okay, let's say we land on the fact that they're an identity graph, right? And they have the ability to stitch together these digital identifiers, these digital linkages, to unify and create this persistent identifier of who these individuals are. But there's different ingredients inside of an identity graph. And there's really two big ingredients that make an identity graph. There's what's called a deterministic. And so you'll hear this big language, right?
I love these
Deterministic,
buzzwords. They're my favorite
right?
buzzwords. Yep.
Right? Or probabilistic. And you know what? What's interesting about that, Jason, is this is going around a lot like a buzzword.
I know, but it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be a buzzword. But I'm hearing it used as one. You know what I mean?
That's right. And that's scary
Yes.
because that is beyond frightening because that is fundamentally critical to the methodology of the accuracy and literally fundamentally critical to the accuracy of the data. It's literally oranges and apples. Let me just start with what a deterministic graph is. I think that's the best way to do it. So we are, for example, a purely deterministic identity graph. Okay. So we're using factual PII, personal identifiable information.
Mhm.
These are digital identifiers, linkages, right? Data linkages. And think of these linkages such as an email address, a phone number, a mobile ad ID, a CTV ID, customer IDs, all of these things, right? That we can sequentially build on a table-based approach, right? So we have a multiple table-based approach to actually match the customer's data across various touch points and devices, right? And so if you think about it, it's like when I look at the back end hierarchy of how our developers have done this, I mean, much smarter people than I, but I mean, there's thousands of scripts that are literally firing in the back end across multiple data points that says, hey, if this is A and that's B and this is C, then this is D and then that's Y. And then that makes this line of, personal identifier information with all of these segments to basically say with 100% certainty and a very high degree of accuracy that this is the person legally opted in, compliant, and it's determining who this person is from first party data. So deterministic matching is based on a 1-to-1 match of a single identifier. Okay,
And that's truly the chef in this scenario.
that's the chef, how this was
Yep.
built,
Yep.
right? And each identifier must match, right, sequentially. And how fast you can put it together, that's a whole other thing. But the point is, we're resolving data extremely fast. But yes, 1-to-1 to 1-to-1 to 1-to-1 to 1 to equal X, right? Probabilistic, on the other hand,
Mhm.
they use statistical algorithms and machine learning to match some customer data access points and devices and touch points, even if there's no direct link between the points.
Yes,
So,
I've actually seen a scenario of this playing out recently, where this person had a very unique last name, and so their first name started with an N, and they had this very unique last name, and it connected it to there was a probabilistic that came in. I was combing through it and connected to some opposite person across the country. All right, because it created this probabilistic scoring of saying, well, that last name is so unique, and how many Nancy's with that last name actually exist. We're going to say the probability is that is the right person. In this case, it wasn't.
And listen, and here's the thing is, I'm going to explain at the very end why there's benefits and pros and cons to both. And here's the thing is, and as we scale out the business, right, we can actually start to use different logic that can be a combination of both. And I'll explain that in a second too. But so where deterministic matching is based on a one-to-one match, right?
Yes.
That a single identifier can be used to match that customer across all devices and all touch points, right? So think about that. One single identifier can be linked across all devices and all touch points. So when you're activating that across the digital pathways, it doesn't matter if, Albert Thompson, 123 Main Street, Anytown, USA, we know that it's a one-to-one match across all devices, across all touch points, that if he scans that QR code at Planet Fitness and he's looking at his device, the screen on the treadmill, and he's watching a YouTube video, or he's watching this podcast,
Yep.
and an ad comes up, right? It doesn't matter because it's a one-to-one identifier that matches across the touch points. Doesn't matter where he's at, as long as that device connects to it. It's that that's the person you're advertising to. Where probabilistic, right, uses those algorithms to actually doesn't matter, right? It cannot have a direct link,
yes.
right? But it can say, hey, listen, that even though between these two data points, there's no personal identifiable link between these two data points, but it can make an educated guess.
Yes.
About which data points belong to that individual.
Yes, I've actually had this problem when I cross the border. I actually run into this problem. So, there is another Jason Donald Harris that was born February 3rd. Now, this other Jason Donald Harris lives on the other side of the country, all right, and has done some things that he probably shouldn't have done, all right? When you cross the border, all right, that's what they're using. They're using a probabilistic scoring of like, wait a second, how many Jason Donald Harrises with this birth date can actually exist? Now, it's happened to me 3 times, and it's never a big deal. They usually just kind of pull me over. They look through my documentation and go, oh, yeah, no, that's not you. But that's what it is. It's this algorithm that's created this probability that this individual could be me, and I get flagged and I get pulled over. So
here's what I love about that, right? Deterministic, very simple. One-to-one match across a data point with a verifiable identifier, right?
Yes.
Linking the 2 points. Probabilistic matching, right? No direct linkage points. It doesn't have to be a direct linkage points. It relies on an algorithm, right? That it can basically connect the dots, such as browsing history, IP addresses, location, to make educated guesses. Probabilistic matching is one-to-many match, meaning that multiple identifiers, right? So remember I said earlier, deterministic is one identifier across all touch points, across all devices, right?
Yes.
Probabilistic is one-to-many match, meaning that multiple identifiers can be used to match that customer's data across multiple touch points and multiple devices in a probabilistic way, right? So I think in short, deterministic matching, the way we view it, right, is it's more accurate and reliable than probabilistic matching.
It's the cream of the crop, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why this is such an incredibly important question. If you're an agency out there, or if you're in charge of marketing for your company, I think this is probably one of the most important questions that you need to be asking. It's not that the other data models. It's not that it's better. I mean, I guess it is better. It's just a higher quality, right? It's like, it's the difference between, me going out there and buying just steak, all right, versus buying Wagyu, all right? It's still beef. It's still beef at the end of the day, all right?
Yep.
There's a very, very, very difference in the quality of how that was built.
Yeah. So, okay, look at it this way, right? Deterministic matching is definitely, we know for certainty. So it depends on the use case, right? So where we are developing an audience management platform, for us, the accuracy of the device level at the household, we couldn't guess at that, right? Because if you look at the shopping profiles at a household, they could be very different, right? So here's an example. I like to share this example, right? So if you did it at the household match and you were trying to probabilistic match, the identities at the household, if you got to 123 Main Street and you're at the Thompson household, right? Well, based on the behaviors and the IPs and the browsing history and all of these things, right? You might make the leap that Albert Thompson is out there buying handbags, high heels, shoes,
I mean, I
dresses.
don't know, Albert. I have spent some time. No, I'm just messing.
Well, I'm just saying, my wife's shopping profile is significantly different than the shopping profile of Albert Thompson.
I would agree with that. Yes.
Right. So, I'm not going to necessarily be the person that the real is going to want to serve ads to.
Yes.
Okay. But, if you knew 100% with certainty that, this is Albert Thompson, these 8 devices are linked to Albert Thompson, well, then guess what? Then I would venture to say that it would probably be better to serve me ads about data technology, or up and coming AI, something along that line, versus an ad for the real. But on the flip side, hey, guess what? There's another person here in his household with other devices that the real does want to get in front of. Well, maybe I don't want them to actually get in front of our household, but yes, in theory, that's how it works. So here's how we can have both, the best of both worlds.
Yes.
Okay. So I think if you start with a deterministic matching logic, right, and depending on that use case, right, I think probabilistic matching, albeit probably less accurate, it can be used to fill in some of the gaps.
Because it's speed. So that was the one thing we talked about earlier, and I wanted to kind of loop back around because we're talking about speed of processing data, right?
Yep. Yeah. I think from a speed standpoint, right, I think both can be equally fast if built correctly. But I think that, the foundational deterministic identity graph will be probably, depending on the use case. I can't speak for every use case out there, right? There's tons of use cases where a probabilistic graph makes perfect sense, and you want to get as much volume as possible, accurate or not. You just need to be able to, get some data. Where I think, for most digital activation use cases, you want to know for certainty you're getting to the right person, the right individual. If you're really focused on identity resolution, which is the core foundational, solution for Driven IQ, it's 100% deterministic. And maybe where we fall short, if we can have 100% deterministic match that A, B, C, D, E, F, and G are all one-to-one matched to Jason Harris, well, we probably wouldn't use probabilistic matching on the main core things, but we might be able to say, hey, probabilistic matching can come in over the top based on these 40 different, site browsing histories to make an assertion that you might be really interested in phishing.
100%, which makes sense. So you run a foundation of deterministic, right?
Yep.
Like at the core, that's what you have to do. And then
Right.
if you want to kind of, fluff it up a little bit, all right, probabilistic makes sense. But I mean, these are the kinds of questions we have to ask, right? It's
Yeah.
like, what is the core of their identity graph? What is the core of their solution? And guys, and just to kind of recap real quick, first thing first, you got to find out if they're a controller or a processor.
Yep.
Right? Like that's your first one. All right. And then you need to ask them, if they have an identity graph, and then of course how that identity graph is built. And deterministic or probabilistic. All right, there's benefits to both, but if you're looking for the cream of the crop, all right, it's a deterministic foundation. And then if needed, it can be brought some probabilistic models in to kind of enhance, all right, that data. But at the core of it needs to be deterministic for it to have that wagyu taste. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. And it's important to know, right? It's important to 100% know, what type of identity graph that they're working with, right? Is it a probabilistic graph? Is it a deterministic graph? How are you foundationally, sourcing your data? Where's this data coming from? Can they show, here's another question, right? Can you show me, or can you, express to me how the sourcing of the data or the data collection is happening, right?
Yes.
Can you show the opt-ins? Can you show where they opted in? Can you show that consent, framework? And I think that that's another important piece of it too.
Well,
right?
I think we need to add that to our top 3 because that's an insanely important piece. I mean, we can do a whole nother podcast just on liability, but
Yep.
at the core, you have to ask this question. So, Albert, how would you properly word that? If you're the agency this time and you're asking a data company, how would you word that?
Can you walk me through your data collection processes? Can you walk me through how you are, implementing those mechanisms? What does the data collection mapping look like for your business? How are you storing that data? And how can you validate and verify, the opt-in, policies? And can you map that? Can you show it? Can you show it to me? Can
Yeah.
you? I mean, very simply put, we expose it, right? So when we actually do our identity resolution and you go onto our platform, we literally will show, hey, this person opted in, this location on this date at this time, and if we needed to, our platform has the ability to be audited down to the actual, place where they, privacy policy where they actually opted in. So can you show that data collection submission process?
And guys, if you're out there, or gals, if you're out there and you're watching, you're listening to this, and that becomes a red flag with the company that you're talking to, it's a big one, okay? Because you can be held liable for this. Like I said, it's almost a whole nother podcast for liability when it comes to that point now, right? But I know we're getting towards the tail end of our conversation today, but look, we have 3 amazing questions, all right, that you have to ask, all right, before you start purchasing data. And we encourage everybody out there watching, listening, you need to be purchasing data, all right? It will literally supercharge, all right, your marketing efforts to a whole nother level if you're not doing it. And if you are doing it, look at ways you can even take it even farther, all right? So you need to ask, all right, are they a controller or are they a processor, okay, right? Then you need to ask, all right, about their identity map. All right, do they have a foundation of it being deterministic? And are they able to layer probabilistic on it to kind of expand on that? And third, and guys, and we can't stress with you how insanely important this question is you need to be able to say, show me the consent. Show me the consent. I need to see it. I need to know how you got it, how you validated it, how you store it. What do you think, Albert? Does that sound good?
I think that's it, man. And I think we can take it from there, right? I think next it should be, how we're unifying the data, how we're activating the data, and implementing customer journeys, and identity resolution, and activating first party data. So I think, yeah, spot on.
That is literally what the next podcast is. So there you guys heard it. There's the teaser. See, I have to, if I let Albert go, he'll just share all of this.
I'll give it all.
I'm gonna make him save it for the next one. But yes, once you have that, you got to take those next steps.
Yeah, I'll leave it with this. I'll leave it with this, Jason, because this is exciting, right? Think of a world, right? I want everyone to get excited about this, because this is where we're going to get to. This is what we're going to talk about.
Love it.
But in a world where for years, right, marketers and brands and advertisers have all been optimizing and managing their campaigns, all based off of just numbers, right? A 3.5% click-through rate or a 33% bounce rate, right? There's a world, and we're going to talk about it, where we need to get to the place where we're talking about people-based targeting, people-based marketing, people-based driven attribution, addressability. So, there's a definite place here where this can really change the entire game as to how marketers activate their data across the digital platform.
And that is why you guys need to tune in for next episode. Hey, for everybody out there watching and listening, we really appreciate you guys taking the time to jam with us today. Albert, this has always been so much fun. Everyone, you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.